Good day, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jeremy Behar, and I am with a company called Cirrus Consulting Group. And the purpose of this webinar today, short webinar, is to talk with you a little bit about the dental office lease and the importance of the dental office lease as it relates to starting a dental practice, running a dental practice, growing a dental practice, and eventually, for most of you, transitioning out of the dental office and the dental profession at the later stages of your career. The title of today's program is Avoiding $100,000 Mistakes in Dental Office Leases, and unfortunately in 2014, 20 years after our business started working with dentists across Canada and the United States to help them avoid these pitfalls, the sad reality is that these pitfalls continue to exist across the country, and dentists continue to sign lease agreements that are not set up in any way to help run the practice and protect the practice from unnecessary cost increases, early terminations, relocations of dental practices, etc. Today's program is about giving you an overview on what you need to know and how to deal with certain aspects of your dental office lease. Very briefly and a little bit about us, because I do think it's important that you understand who we are, who I am, and why it is that we are running this webinar and have the partners across the country that we do. Other organizations within the dental industry, Henry Schein Dental, Bank of America, and others that turn to us to help their customers ensure that they're signing the right lease documentation. Our business was founded back in 1994, 20 years ago, by a group of dentists, 4 dentists, specifically for the purpose of helping properly set up what is considered to be one of the single biggest expenses in the running of a dental office, the lease payments, lease agreement, and how to avoid getting stuck. Our business has evolved over the last 20 years to the point where today about 1,000 dental offices from across the country, dentists, startup doctors, renewals, relocations, new practice openings on a second or third location, and soon-to-be retiring doctors send us copies of their leases each year. About 1,000 of them get analyzed by our firm. We read them and get back to doctors and engage in strategic conversations about what to do, how to do it, and ultimately what you're trying to accomplish through the process. Of those, we get hired to negotiate approximately 500 dental office leases each year. So everything that we're going to talk about today really culminates out of what we're seeing and experiencing on the front lines of what's happening between landlords and dentists across the country. In the last 20 years, we've negotiated over 10,000 dental office leases specific to the dental industry and the needs of dentists as it relates to this type of agreement. Every year, we are asked to speak at about 150 different speaking engagements, everything from small study club, local study club meetings to some of the largest dental conventions in the country. We are asked to bring our content out and talk to doctors about how to make sure that they're setting themselves up properly. And then our programs are and have been for about a decade and a half now, fully CE accredited across the country, and we're fairly proud of that. The purpose of today's webinar, threefold. Number one, want to talk a little bit about the importance, the uniqueness of the dental office lease, why the dental office lease is so different from the lease agreements that sit underneath most commercial tenants in the country today and their landlords. Number two, I'm going to go through a few key components that will help you grow, protect, and eventually sell the practice. A few things that you want to be thinking about, high-level concepts, and then we'll kind of bring that right down to how those high-level concepts impact the specifics of how your lease is structured. And then thirdly, our firm we are big believers philosophically in every time we interact with doctors to ensure that we're leaving some practical ideas, thoughts, tidbits behind that you can do something with, something that will help you run your dental office a little bit better, help you make some money, help you save some money. And there will be a little bit of that close to the end of today's webinar to make sure that the time that you spent with us on this webinar was well spent. So what is a lease agreement? And this is a question that we ask our audiences all across the country. What is a lease? What does it do? And the answer to that question is that it is a legally binding document, contract, agreement, between two parties, the landlord and the tenant. Critical for landlords to have tenants on leases because being in the business of owning commercial property and managing these properties is a very expensive, a very capital-intensive business to be in. And so many, many years ago, hundreds if not thousands of years ago, owners of land figured that if they could get their tenants to not only commit to 1 week or 1 month at a time, but commit to years at a time, that they would have predictability in their businesses by way of annuitized cash flow, predictable income that comes in year after year after year to help them run their businesses. In the dental world, that would be like us putting an 8-year agreement in front of a patient and saying, if you want to come in and have some hygiene work done, you can't just come in here once and do it and we're not sure if you're going to come back again. You need to sign this agreement whereby you agree to show up 3 times a year for the next 8 to 10 years for hygiene work at a minimum. And that's what landlords have figured out to do with the lease agreement. Now let's flip over to the tenant side for a minute. A lease agreement does something very important for tenants in general, is it gives them predictability as to how we can use the space, how long we get the keys to the office for, how much it's going to cost us today, and in many cases, how much it's going to cost us tomorrow. How will this rent increase over time based on what formula? The dental office lease, in our mind, is basically a relationship agreement. It's a prenuptial agreement. And in much the same sense as you're thinking right now, a prenuptial between a husband and a wife, a dental office lease, a lease agreement, it not only outlines how we have to behave with one another, the obligations to one another between the landlord and tenant over the course or the life of the lease agreement, it also outlines specifically what happens if things go wrong. What happens if a rent payment gets missed? What happens if the shopping center or half of it burns down? How do we relate to one another and interact with one another in the event of some type of unpredictable or catastrophic incident or something that were to happen? And that's a big part of the lease agreement and what the lease agreement is. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that at Cirrus Consulting Group, we have about 1,000 dental offices send us copies of their leases every year to look at, to review. Well, when they end up in our office, they come in through the front door. We open up the envelopes and we take a look at the lease. And the very first thing that we see when we see a lease agreement is we see this. Not because there's one of these checks stapled to the front of every lease to cover the cost of the analysis. No, not at all. But because when we see a lease agreement, what we first see in our minds is a very significant financial commitment that's being made by the tenant to the landlord. A lease agreement is a check. And while landlords have been very good over the years at communicating the cost of this product to us by way of rent per square foot, in some parts of the country that's calculated on the basis of a monthly rent per square foot. So for example, in California, your landlord might communicate to you that the rent for the space is $2.75 a square foot. Then you have to multiply that by 12 months in order to arrive at what the annual rent will be. Many other parts of the country, landlords communicate it by way of annual rent. It will be $23 a square foot, and that would be the annual cost net rent per square foot. What we see when we see these leases is significant financial commitments the dentists make to their landlords when they sign a new lease or when you sign a renewal. Because ultimately what you're doing is, when the landlord says, I want to take you from $18 to $20 a square foot at renewal time, not only should you be thinking about the $2 cost difference or increase that you're now being asked to spend for basically the same product, but you need to take into consideration the overall cost of this commitment. So take the $22 now, whatever it is, $20, add the triple net charges of $15 a square foot in that particular building, multiply it by the 1,800 square feet, come up with the annual rent, call it $75,000 a year, and then multiply that number by the next 10 years, taking into consideration that there will be percentage year-over-year increases applied to it. Without those percentage increases, it's a $750,000, $750,000 commitment. Once you factor in those increases year over year, this 55-page document that the landlord is putting in front of you at the start of your term, or the 4-page renewal document that the landlord is putting in front of you at renewal time, is actually a very significant financial commitment. Interestingly, and most dentists don't really think about it like this, every time you renew your lease agreement, it is that you are spending or committing to spend as much money in a legally binding way as if you were going out and buying a second practice. Anyone could buy a second practice in their market for the cost of what their lease payments added up over the 5 or 10 years would cost them, and that's exactly what you're doing here. Now, one other question. Interestingly, something that the world has taught many of us, almost all of us, since the time that we were very young, as it relates to the single biggest purchase we're ever going to make in our life. When I ask audiences what the single biggest commitment or purchase we're going to make in our life will be, most people in the audience raise their hand and they say their home. And the reality is if you're not a dentist, that is 100% correct. The single biggest purchase the average person makes is their home. When you're a dentist, the single biggest financial commitment you make in your life is to your landlord. If you are to add up all of the money that you're going to spend in rent from the time that you get into the business of dentistry early in your career until the time that you sell the keys to the office and transition and retire some 20 or 30 years later, the amount of money that's going to be showing on that little calculator as you figure this number out is going to be substantial. In most cases, far greater than the value of one's home, no matter where in the country you live. And so please keep in mind that every time you renegotiate or renew or start up a lease agreement or a practice, you need to keep in mind that you are moving forward on the basis of a very substantial commitment. And we'll talk in a few minutes about what to do and how to make sure that you're agreeing to that commitment and playing that game as best as possible. Now, why is the dental office lease so important? Why is the dental office lease more important to dentists than a typical commercial lease is to the average commercial tenant? There's a number of reasons why going through life as a dentist, renting space without a lease agreement, without that commitment from the landlord is not a good thing. You need a dental office lease and you need it properly structured for you and your business. Here's why. Number one, the dental office is one of the, if not the most expensive business on a per pound, on a per square foot basis to get into than almost any other commercial business around you in your building or shopping center. Let me rephrase that. It costs more to get into dentistry than to get into just about any other type of business, period. Whether you buy a practice, and that's how you enter into or shift from being an associate into owning your own practice, or whether you find an empty box and you build it out from scratch, and that's how you move from being an associate to moving into owning your own practice, either way, it is a very expensive endeavor, number one. Number two, once you have made that decision and you've committed to that next step and you've paid that money, again, whether you've bought a practice or built a practice, that money that you've now invested in the space is there and it's there for good. Okay? It's very, very difficult to take it away, which brings me to point number three. If 6 months after you decided to get into this business and you either bought or built, and you're driving into the office one day and you kind of look left and you look right and you decide that you no longer like the space that you're in, you really want to be 1 mile down the road, how easy or difficult is it to pick this factory up, pick up your practice and move it 1 mile down the road to another empty box? It's not. It's extremely expensive a business to be in, highly capital intensive. Number two is it's very difficult to pick it up and move it. Number three, it's very expensive to pick it up and move it. And number four is it's hugely disruptive when it's not done with the right amount of time and planning. And even in that case, it's still disruptive to the practice. Anytime a dentist picks up an office and moves it, there's always a little bit of attrition. And so, statistically, most dental offices across the country do not move. They stay right where they are from the time they start their career until the time they end their career. In fact, we meet dentists across the country every day there are second, third, and sometimes fourth generation dentists within the same office and same building after many, many, many years of it being there, because it works. It continues to work. And because it continues to be a challenge, both from a cost and an operational standpoint, to pick it up and move it. Now, how does this relate back to the lease agreement? Because of all of these three or four factors that we just discussed, you want your lease agreement to provide you with as much long-term stability and security, as much runway, as much commitment from the landlord in the space as you can possibly get. You want your dental office lease to give you a long amount of time to, at your discretion, stay in the space without your landlord being able to come to you 5 years later and say, hey, listen, guess what? We've decided to rent the space to the tenant next door to you. As soon as your lease expires, please give us the keys back because they want to expand into your space. And that would be a problem. And by the way, folks, that's happening every day across the country because dentists are not setting these things up well. So 10-year leases plus as many 5-year options to renew as you can get is the key. Long-term leases, lots of options to renew, will have a big impact on you and your business and its predictability and its valuation. Number 2, you need your lease agreement to help you minimize risk and exposure. What does that mean? It means that most dentists today, overwhelmingly, are still signing leases personally, putting their names on these leases, and giving landlords unlimited personal guarantees throughout the life of the lease and the course of their careers. And this is not the best way to do it. The worst way to sign a lease as a tenant is into one's personal name, which is how the overwhelming majority of dentists in the country are doing it. The best way, on the other end of the spectrum, to sign a lease is into some kind of corporation that functions on the tenant's behalf as the tenant in a way where the corporation becomes the tenant and the dentist is a director of that corporation. Now, depending on what state and province and all kinds of other factors that need to be considered here, I can't get into the specifics of what type of mechanism, corporation, tool you would want to use that's right for you, but I can tell you that a great way to control, manage, cap, or eliminate your risk and exposure to a landlord and commercial real estate is to look at the way that you're signing this lease agreement. Dentists in the early stages of their careers are asked to sign personal guarantees because when they step up to the plate and try to do a new deal with a new landlord and have very little business track record or history, landlords are asking for some guarantees. That's a lot more reasonable than a dentist who's been in a building for 27 years who has always given unlimited personal guarantees and is being continued or is being asked to continue to give personal guarantees even though they have a great long business track record of paying rent on time for 27 years. Big difference. And so you need to examine where you're at in your life, what stage you're at, what your lease looks like today, and what the ideal or optimal scenario would be as to how to set up this lease. Now, one caveat. Please don't go out tomorrow to your attorneys and ask them to go and set up a corporation to set up this lease immediately as the first step, because that's not the first step. The first step is getting your landlord to agree to move this lease out of your name and into some kind of corporation or cap the exposure to you on the way that this lease is set up. That's step number 1, is to go through a careful, thoughtful discussion, negotiation process with your landlord. Depending on how you come out of that negotiation and what they've agreed to, step 2 might be then moving on and going ahead and having a corporation set up. But that would be step 2. Number 3, you need your lease agreement to help you maximize your flexibility as a dentist. Because the overwhelming majority of dentists follow a very similar path throughout the course of their careers, people go through a need for flexibility at a lot or much the same time from one to the other. And what does that mean? Of those of you on this webinar today, how many of you are thinking of selling a dental office sometime in the next 20 years? And if the overwhelming majority of you are raising your hand right now thinking, yeah, that's me, I fall into that category, which is the majority of you, my next question to you is, what makes you think you have the right to sell your dental office sometime in the next 20 years? Have you built the flexibility into your lease agreement to enable you to sell your practice? Now, keep this in mind. When one sells a dental office, part of what has to happen through the process of moving the business from your hands to the buyer's hands is a transfer of the lease agreement and the lease obligations. You have to ask your landlord for permission to transfer that lease. They stand in the way between you and retirement. Now, they might be having a good day, and they might say, yeah, sure, no problem, here's your consent. Or they might be not having such a good day, or they might be opportunistic, and they might come back to you and say, no, thank you. We're not interested in giving you the approval to transfer your lease to another doctor. We want you to be here, and if it's not you, we want nobody to be here. And what you need as a form of flexibility critical to the dental industry is what we call an assignment and transfer provision built into your lease that enables you to transition out of dentistry in a way where you can transfer your practice because there's a predictable mechanism built into your lease enabling you to do so. Rather than going down the path of assuming, which too many doctors do, that the day they wake up and they and their family decide it's time to retire and sell, they're going to, don't assume, because doctors every week, every day, every month are facing challenging situations with landlords at the 11th hour of the sale process who are saying, hang on a minute, let us figure out what's going on here. By the way, how much are you selling your practice for? So one form of flexibility, as an example, is the assignment provision. Very, very important. There are about 24 other forms of flexibility that need to be built into, customized into a dental office lease that are specific to your industry that you require to help you run your practice, grow your practice, protect your practice, and exit your practice, because all of you are going to want to go through those stages in your career. Number 4, your dental office lease should be set up in a way where you accomplish fair and affordable financial terms with the landlord. Economics, rents that are reasonable. Reasonable in the context of both the office that you run and the production that you generate per year. So that's the internal affordability. And then it needs to be aligned with external affordability. Is the rents that the landlord is asking me to pay or to increase to at renewal time consistent with what's happening in the market around me? So for example, if the market around me is increasing by between 4 and 7% every 2 to 3 years, and that's what the market data tells us, and the landlord asks me for a 4 to 7% increase in my space at renewal time, that's probably pretty reasonable. But if the landlord is asking me for a 4 to 7% increase at renewal time right now in a market that has gone down by 11%, and 5 years ago the strip plaza that I'm in had 15 units and no vacancy, and today the strip plaza that I'm in has 15 units, 11 of which are vacant, that's a very different scenario. So the only way to figure out how to avoid unnecessary cost increases due to landlords that are looking to make up for lost income through you is to do your homework, do your research. It takes time. You have to ask yourself some questions. What are the vacancy rates in my building? How much vacant space is there? How are the vacancy rates trending? Are they trending up or down over the last 2 or 3 years? Because this is all about trends. How are occupancy rates looking? And how are they trending? And what's happened to rental rates for my type of space in my market over the last 2 to 3 years? Are they going up, staying the same, or going down? And very, very rarely do they stay the same. They're always generally moving either up or down. We have a lot of science that we apply to this that our research team looks at to understand what's happening specifically within markets across the country as it relates to the dental industry. Not Starbucks, not Home Depot, not Walmart, but specifically as it relates to dental offices. So as to point number 4, we're all being asked to commit to significant expenses by our landlords and sometimes significant increases. And the best way to have those conversations is to try to figure out and know before going into that conversation what your landlord knows about what's happening in the market, as opposed to just going in cold. And number 5, the dental office lease is critical to helping you make your way through, as we talked about earlier with the assignment, a part of everyone's career that they're going to want to go through at some point, which is the exit. Whether you're 30, 40, 50, 60, or 70 years old, as a dentist, ensure that you have the lease agreement set up in a way where it will help you as an asset sell your practice at the highest value in the most predictable way, as opposed to the way it's set up today, which potentially is a liability that will prevent you from selling at the highest price in the most predictable way, or worse, from selling at all. And that happens quite often. So the lease agreement needs to be set up well and customized to your business. We talked a few minutes ago about the lease agreement being one of the key components of a transfer of a business. What are the 3 key saleable components of your practice? When one sells their practice, and this is specific to general dentistry, although the lease applies to specialty as well, what are we selling when we put a for sale sign up on our practice? The 3 key or main components that we're selling when we sell a dental office are, number 1, the equipment, number 2, the goodwill, and then number 3, the lease agreement. And the lease agreement is set up in this graph or in this graphic as the glue, as the base of the factory, as the rug that's under everything, that holds everything together. If that lease agreement were to get removed or pulled out from under the dental practice, the equipment and the goodwill and the staff and you and everything else that's connected to or supports you in doing what you do in selling dentistry would come apart at the seams immediately. If a landlord decided to terminate your lease early, the dental practice has a problem. If the landlord decided to relocate you to another part of the shopping center, gave you 30 days notice, but it would take you 10 months to get to the other side, which is not unreasonable or an unrealistic amount of time, we have a problem, because all of these components that in front of you right here on this chart fit nicely together all of a sudden come apart. The factory is no longer working. You no longer have the same facility to see patients, mentor and coach and lead your staff, and generate production and sell dentistry. So, important. A few concepts, high level, that I want to talk to you about. Again, as it all relates back to what your dental office lease should be doing for you. Number 1, the economics. Economics are critical, as we talked about a few minutes ago, and we've got to get that pillar right. We've got to make sure that whatever it is that we're agreeing to with our landlords, and by the way, when we buy this product, when we agree with a landlord that we're going to pay $17 a square foot, we're not just agreeing to buy the product today. We're agreeing to buy it today and every day for the next 10 years, 120 months. It's a long time. We're also agreeing to rent escalations. We're also agreeing to definitions of triple net charges. We're also, in startup situations, asking for free rents, tenant improvement allowances, landlord's work. We're agreeing to security deposits. Pillar number 1, the economics. We've got to make sure that the financial deal that we're moving towards and eventually agreeing to with a landlord is reasonable. Number 2, concept number 2, pillar number 2, protection. We need to make sure that the lease agreement is like a moat around our office, helping us protect it. We do that in a number of ways, but a couple of ideas. Number 1, using lots of term and options to give us lots of runway to keep our practice where it is for as long as we choose to, and using options to renew to help us then add extensions to that runway as we get down or go down that path and decide to use them. That's one way of adding protection through the lease to your office. Number 3, concept number 3, pillar number 3, flexibility. As dentists, we require a significant amount of flexibility to help us zig and zag through our careers. One of them I mentioned earlier, the assignment provision, critical to helping us sell our office. Critical to helping us bring associates into our office, whether they be general dentists or specialists, doesn't matter. If we're either doing it today or are planning to do it at some point potentially within the next 10 or 20 or 30 years of our career, let's build the flexibility into the lease to ensure that we have the rights to do that. Another form of flexibility, death and disability, whereby you go ahead and you sign a lease agreement, and you sign it for 10 years. 2 years into that 10-year lease agreement, you die. You get hit by a truck on the freeway one day, and you're gone. What happens next? Number one is your family will try to sell the office as quickly as they can. But number two is, in the event that they cannot sell, depending on what's happening in your market or the economy in general at that time, who knows, they need the right to be able to get out of the lease, to back out of it in a predictable way. Because if they can't sell the office and there's 8 years left of term and monthly rental payments that are due every month for the next 8 years, guess what? They are obligated to pay that rent every month despite the fact that there is no production coming in to help offset those rents. A death and disability provision gives you, your family, or your estate, if it's set up well, the right, the flexibility to be able to terminate that lease early in the event of a death or disability. Very important. Number three, flexibility as a critical concept. And number four, you want the lease agreement to help you manage your risk and exposure and the risk and exposure that you take on every day for your business. How do you do that? Look out for risks, pitfalls, traps. Lease agreements have lots of flexibility built into them for landlords. So what types of flexibility? If the landlord gets contacted one day by a big grocery store chain who wants to take up 4 units within the center, right where you are, and they decide to pick you up and move you somewhere else or to the back of the center where there's no windows and no natural light, you have a problem. Not only is the space not conducive to your business, but you may have 6 months of downtime, dark time, by the time you have your keys taken away from you in the old space, the current space, until the time that you're built out and ready to go and see patients in the new space. And by the way, in the instance of relocation, how do you think landlords set these things up? Do you think that they go down this path of relocating a dental office knowing full well that they're going to pay to rebuild a brand new office elsewhere in the center? No. They set these things up so that you as the tenant, if you get relocated, have to pay to go from A to B. And that is a tough surprise expense to be hit with at any point during one's career, and it happens. The other is demolition. Some landlords have clauses within their leases that say they reserve the right to terminate the lease early in the event they decide to redevelop the property. Keep in mind, you may be in areas where every landlord has these in their lease because every landlord in that area are going through actively a redevelopment of properties. Areas are gentrifying, and high-rises are going up. And I mean, who knows? But you need to first know that this is in the lease. Number two is you want to try to get it out, or at least water it down, giving you more notice period, potentially giving you some money at the end of it if they exit you, etc. But if you can't get it out, then at least knowing that it exists and it's there will help you make better decisions in running your business, and you will know and not get hit by surprise if it happens one day, as most dentists do when they get this letter from their landlord saying, please, your lease is terminated in 90 days, we're demolishing the center, and then it comes as a complete surprise. So understand the risks that are in your lease as they relate to your practice, because knowing that they're there means that you understand that these risks exist, and two, give you an opportunity to strategically do something about them. We talked earlier on about options to renew being a significant form of flexibility for you. And here is one form of an option to renew provision. All of you, or at least most of you, have this type of clause in your lease when you have an option to renew. You have to be very careful at how these clauses are worded, because when they come from the landlord baked into their quote-unquote standard form lease, they're generally not set up in a way that actually helps you as opposed to hurts you. So here I'll give you an example in this particular clause. And by the way, This option to renew is found in 90% of the dental office leases that we read every year. So of the 1,000 dental office leases that get sent to us every year, 900 of them read like this. The very first sentence of this option to renew provision is problematic. It starts off by saying, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. Well, what if Dr. Joe Black is 63 years old, planning to sell his office, is writing out a 10-year lease right now. There's 2 years to go, but there's 2 5-year options to renew. And the buyer is saying, oh, this is great, no problem. There's 2 years left plus 2 5-year options to renew. Except that then they take a look at the lease because they send it to someone to read the lease agreement before they buy the practice who understands these documents, the way these things are worded, and says, hang on a minute. You're buying a dental office with 2 years left and 2 5-year options to renew. The only problem is those options to renew won't exist so long as this transfer happens. It starts off by saying, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. If Dr. Joe Black, the original tenant, the selling dentist, is no longer there because he transfers the lease to someone else, those options to renew have just evaporated. They've disappeared. And that is a big problem. That's a problem for Dr. Black. If you are a selling dentist at some point in the future, this could have a big impact on your practice. If you're a buying dentist, not only will this have an impact on you guaranteed, you may not even get your deal financed if a bank realizes that despite the fact that their minimum term criteria on your lease is 7 to 10 years, that there's 2 years left at the most after you buy the practice before the landlord could take the keys away or not rent to you or relocate you or increase your rents unreasonably. That's one example of a number of risks that are found in this particular paragraph in front of you. There's about 4 others. I'm not going to go through them all on this webinar, but just understand that the risks exist in these clauses. Assignment, very similar. We talked about the assignment provision. A lot of risks found in this particular clause. Halfway through that paragraph, there's a sentence that says, within 15 days after the receipt by the landlord of such request for consent, the landlord shall have the option to terminate the lease, which means all you have to do as a selling dentist is go to the landlord and ask them for permission to transfer this lease to the buying dentist, and the landlord has now been put in a position where they can legally send you back a letter and say, dear doctor, thank you for exercising your request under Section 42 to sign this lease. We hereby exercise our rights under Section 42 to terminate this lease effective immediately. Please have the keys back to us within 30 days. Now, that is happening every day. Landlords are doing this. Why are landlords doing this? It's a great way to make money, because if you desperately want to retire and sell your practice and come into a significant amount of money through that event, and the landlord is looking to make a few extra dollars that particular year on their rental income statement, and you've just given them this opportunity, you've now put them in a position where they can either block your sale, because no one's going to buy the practice from you if they don't get control of the lease, or they may put you into a position where they're now costing you monies, significant money, that you never considered that you'd have to spend to make your way through this sale process. So assignment provisions, critical. And by the way, at least 3/4 of the dental office leases that we read every day here have these types of risks built into a critical clause for dental offices, the transfer provisions. So take a look at yours, see what's in there, give us a call if you've got questions on it. Happy to go through this stuff with you. But understand that these risks exist in it, and step 1 is understanding where they are and how they can impact your practice and your future plans. One last risk I want to just run through very briefly. Many leases, 50% of the leases, dental office leases that we read every year, have a right to relocate the premises, a landlord's right to relocate the premises, which means that the landlord, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, can send you a letter at any point whereby they pick you up and they move you to another part of the center. Now, what happened if they picked you up and they moved you from what was 1,500 square feet in your current premises to 1,800 square feet in the new premises? What happens is you have to take it. But let me ask you this. while you think that now the extra space that you have to pay for and buy is a problem, which it is, let me flip that example around and give you another illustration. What happens if they pick you up and they move you from 1,500 square feet, which is your space today, to 1,200 square feet in the new premises? Is that a problem? And the answer is yes, that's a bigger problem. It's a bigger problem because you just lost an operatory. And if you lose an op, how much production have you just lost annually that you were producing out of that particular operatory? So this stuff is problematic. Secondly, who do you think pays for moving you and rebuilding your dental office 4 units down the hall? It isn't the landlord. It's not how they're structuring this stuff. They have no interest in building dental offices. So be very careful as you go through your lease and read this stuff. There are many other important components, parts of dental office leases. We've talked about a couple of them. On the left side of this slide, you'll see a clause that says surrender. We got a call a couple weeks ago. We were asked to give our opinion on a dental office lease for a general dentist in Michigan who recently, 2 years ago, upgraded their cabinetry. I believe they spent between $120,000 and $140,000 on all new ADEC cabinetry. And they called us up because their lease is now expiring in 3 months from now. They went out into the marketplace and they bought their own building. And as soon as they notified the landlord that they were moving at the end of the term, giving the keys back, thank you for 20 years of fun here in the center, Mr. Landlord, the landlord responded back with a letter saying, hey, no problem, thank you. You've been a pleasure to have here as a tenant. By the way, per the surrender provisions of the lease agreement, please make sure that you leave those ADEC cabinets behind because we consider them a part of the premises since they are affixed to the office, and we will be taking immediate control and ownership over those cabinets as soon as you leave. You can only imagine what the doctor is now going through, having just spent a significant amount of money upgrading the cabinets. It's a problem. And our opinion was, unfortunately, back to this doctor and her attorney, that because of the way that the lease was set up 8 years ago or 9.5 years ago, whatever it was, they actually set this lease up, the landlords, to give themselves the right to do this, and it was never caught through the negotiations and reworded in a way that helps protect this expensive investment and equipment. So again, another example, this is important stuff. On to some practical items. Timing is everything. Timing the lease cycle, the lease process, is critical. And what do I mean by that? Very simple. Make sure if you have a lease and you're a renewing doctor, coming up on a renewal sometime in the next 0 to 24 months, 2 years, if you have a lease agreement that's coming up for renewal within the next 24 months, you should be actively working on that renewal right now. You shouldn't be waiting until 3, 6, or 9 months or less prior to the end of the term to start dealing with this properly, because I'm going to tell you something that your landlords know about your business that you may not know, and that is that to pick up a dental office and move it anywhere, whether it's down the hall or whether it's 15 miles away, it takes time and it takes money. But the time is what I want to focus on. It takes, on average, in the country today, for the most part, and we do this lecture and gather this information everywhere, it takes somewhere between 8 at the very minimum and fastest to 12 months or more to properly move a dental office. Now, when I say move, here's what I'm referring to. You have to find a new office. You have to negotiate a new lease, design the space, permit the space, choose a contractor, build it out, and once it's done, get everything moved over. That's what I mean when I say move. And to do that takes time. Now, if I'm your landlord and I know that there's only 4 months left to the end of the term, and that if I put an unreasonable rent increase in front of you, that the chances of you picking up and moving because of the amount of time you have left till the end of the term is 2 or 3% chance that you're going to move, I am going to play by the odds, and I am going to make myself some money over the next 5 years by taking a chance that you're going to agree to the requests that I ask for, as opposed to picking up and moving because you don't have the time to do it. As opposed to starting this process with 24 months to go and having the time and the leverage to help get yourself a better deal, because simply knowing that you have the time to go through the process of picking up and planning a move makes most landlords think twice about how unreasonable the request is actually going to be when you get to this point. So, practical tip for you, and all of you can learn how to do this better than you're doing it today. Track your dates very carefully and make sure you start the lease renewal process early and on time, 24 months. Take a look at your dates as you're listening to this webinar. Look at the critical dates on your lease agreement. Figure out when it expires. Reverse engineer it by 2 years. That's the day you should be starting the process of renegotiating the lease. Now, what do we mean when we say start the process? I want to share this with you briefly, practical tip number 2. This is the lease negotiation process that we go through when we get hired to negotiate leases 500 times a year for dental offices across the country. There is nothing that we do that I'm leaving out of this process. We start with the orange box, gathering all the documentation, all the previous lease history. Leasing space from commercial landlords is very paper intensive. You want to pull it all together. You then want to go through the process of reading it all from cover to cover and familiarizing yourself with what's in it. Because if you don't know what's in it, what your lease says, how it's worded, then you don't know where the risks are. And if you don't know where the risks are in your lease agreement, you won't know what to negotiate and how to prioritize your negotiations. Very simple, and you'll do what most tenants do, which is, hey, Mr. Landlord, how much is my new rent going to be? Okay, good, let's move forward and sign this thing off. And that's it, and you've just missed all these traps and pitfalls of setting yourself up strategically. Number 3, this is where you want to do some market research and understand, as we talked about earlier, what is going on in the marketplace around you, what's happening by way of rents trending, occupancy rates trending, how are things moving in the market, how can we try to predict as best as possible what our landlord's going to ask for and how we're going to counter that ask with some science. And you need to go through that process because it doesn't just happen on its own. Number 4, outcome and strategy development. Simple. At this stage in the process, we ask ourselves a question. What is my desired end goal? What am I trying to accomplish, achieve, as it relates to my lease? At what point will I know that I've gotten what I need to get here and I'm ready to sign this thing and move on? How old am I? What stage am I at in my career? Am I planning to expand the office? Am I planning to bring in an associate? How far away from transition and sale am I? How's my health? How much am I enjoying doing what I do on a daily basis? All of those questions and more factor into what should the lease agreement be doing for you for the next 5 or 10 years as opposed to the last 5 or 10 years. Because as every decade passes in our lives, something significant changes. And your lease agreement, as the real estate part of your business, needs to take all of that into consideration as you come up with a strategy. Now we've gone through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we haven't yet picked up the phone and called the landlord. All we've done is prepare for the negotiation. Now we go to step 5, the lease negotiation financials negotiation. This is where we pick up the phone and we start the process of working with the landlords on the economic skeleton of a lease agreement, the financials, the rents, the rent escalations, free rents, paint and carpet money, deposits, all the economic related items that are part of the lease agreement. Usually page 1 of the 50 or 60 pages are now negotiated at this point. You go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Once you eventually come to an agreement with the landlord at this stage, you then move to step 5, which is step 6, which is the lease documentation process. This is where you've now negotiated page 1 of the lease agreement, all the economics. Now we need to set our sights on the other 59 pages. What do they say? How are they worded? How do they need to be changed, rewired, relanguaged so that they help us do what it is that we want to do as a dentist? And then we go back and forth with landlords or their attorneys and relanguage, wordsmith the leases. And then when the final leases come in ready for signature, we read them one last time, each one of them, to make sure that they were prepared by the landlord in a form that is consistent with what was agreed to during the negotiation process. This, folks, just gives you a very brief, high-level overview of a treatment plan for dealing with your office lease, a process. Like any process, if you want to achieve a desired outcome or desired end goal, follow a process step by step to get you to that desired end goal. This, applying this process to your lease agreement every 5 or 10 years, is no different than the treatment plan or the process that you put in front of your patients when they show up and want you to take them from A, the way they are today, to B, the way they would like to look and feel tomorrow. No different, and this is a much better way of going through the lease negotiation process. The evolution of a dental career. Again, I talked earlier about the zigging and zagging of one's career and some of the things that you need to take into consideration depending on the stage in dentistry that you're at. Number one, all the way to the left, startup or purchase phase of your career. When you're in that stage, and without getting into too much age stuff, typically sort of late 20s, early 30s, maybe mid-30s, you buy a practice, you start up a practice. You want to focus on lots of term, giving yourself a lot of runway for this investment you just made. You need options to renew, for sure. You need death and disability provisioning to help protect you and your family and your kids and your home and other investments that you have in your lives. In your life, and then you want to manage cost controls. You want to make sure that you understand very carefully how things will escalate over time, what other costs you can get hit with, either monthly or annually, because at this stage of one's career, every nickel is going back towards paying down debt, and you have to be very careful with how it's set up. And then we move into our mid to late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and we deal with renewals of the lease every 5 or 10 years. You want to focus on personal guarantees. You want to continue to add more renewal options to the end of your leases as you keep turning them over. You want to focus on things like associate rights. Now you're at a stage in your office where over the last 10, 12, 15 years, production has gotten up there and you're ready to bring on someone else to give you a half a day off a week and to continue to grow the size of the office, production, efficiency, et cetera. Expansions or office relocations, some of the things that you want to focus on that we can highlight, again, personal guarantees, because you now have, if you're expanding an office or relocating an office, you have track record behind you. You have, even though you may be meeting a new landlord as you relocate your office, you have business history, 10, 20 years, sometimes maybe more. Leverage that to try to manage the guarantees you give them. You want to, again, focus on as much term and options as you can get. You want to focus on transition flexibility. So one example of that is the assignment clause, making sure it's set up right. And again, death and disability rights to protect you and your family from the risks of commercial real estate. Stage 4, someone who is within 5 to 10 years of selling their office or less. You want to make sure that you have laser focused yourself on how the transition clauses and wording in your lease is set up to enable you to do so. Personal guarantees, making sure that you minimize or eliminate them because not only do you not want them hanging out there today, you don't want them following you into retirement after you have sold the office and no longer have any control over the real estate. Not a risk you should be going into retirement with. And again, lots of term and options because the more term and options you can sell your practice with, the more value that practice will have in the eyes of both a purchaser and an appraiser and a lending institution that is going to be asked to finance the deal. It will have a big impact on your practice. This slide, folks, really is just to highlight some of the different stages of a dentist's career. Again, this is not comprehensive. It's very high level, but just to give you an idea of the different things that you need to be focusing on depending on where you're at in the life cycle of your career. A few key takeaways from today's program because it's about time for us to wind down this webinar. Number one, focus on the details of your lease. The details can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars if left alone. It's not about just what's on page one. Page one matters, don't get me wrong. The rents are a huge cost component of your life and your career for many of you. But it's not just about what's on page one. It's about what's on the other 59 pages of the lease agreement. To us, philosophically, we believe that the focus should be on minimizing risk, maximizing flexibility and practice value, and achieving long-term peace of mind. And that's what this is all about, is making sure that the lease is set up to help you steer your business in the right way. Be strategic. Some of you have heard this before. You don't get what you deserve. You get what you negotiate. And that is important. It's critical. Negotiate this stuff into your lease because it won't otherwise end up in there just because. You have to make sure that you've taken this landlord tool, landlord-created tool that is built and set up and engineered to help them and rewire it so that it not only does for them what they need, which is help them with their predictable revenue streams, but helps you run and drive and grow your business and sell your business. Start the process early. That is the practical tip of today. Make sure that you start the renewal process at least 24 months prior to the end of the lease term to give yourself maximum time, maximum leverage, and the best chance of getting the best deal. Do your homework and research and have a plan. You apply this bullet to the work that you do every day. As clinicians, you know what you're doing, you know what you're talking about, you read, you learn, you talk to other doctors, you work with a plan that you apply every day to the work that you do with patients. Apply the same planning process to this event that happens once every 5 or 10 years in your life because it will have an enormous positive impact on the outcome. That is all for today's webinar, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed. I hope it was a good use of about 55 minutes of your time. The goal for us was to highlight some of the important parts of the dental office lease, the things that you need to be thinking about before you go out into the world and sign these with landlords, which is happening by dentists hundreds of times a day all across the country. We are here as a resource for you. Feel free to give us a call anytime and talk to us about your lease agreement. I am available anytime to speak to any of you on this webinar. My direct line is 647-789-3226. My email address is on the screen, and our 800 number, 1-800-459-3413. You can visit our website. There are some incredible tools on our website to help you, www.cirrusconsultinggroup.com. Hope you enjoyed this webinar. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye-bye.